I woke up to a light, almost weightless touch, something warm and wet against my palm. When I opened my eyes, I saw Roy, my German shepherd, watching me intently, his head tilted to the side. His dark eyes reflected the morning light through the curtains. I sighed, feeling heavy, like my body had absorbed all the fatigue I'd tried to ignore overnight. My husband had already left. The usual note, neatly left on the nightstand, read: "Have breakfast. Love you." How right. How thoughtful. How familiar. I ran my fingers over the paper, and something inside me twitched. It was the same as it had always been. And that was scary. Roy, as if sensing something, put his front paws on the bed and leaned closer, peering intently into my face. There was more understanding in his gaze than I was willing to accept. "You read my mind, don't you?" I mumbled, reaching for him. He wagged his tail happily and, without waiting for permission, gently rubbed his nose against my cheek, then jumped to the floor and headed for the door. I smiled. Sometimes I felt like Roy was the only one who really understood me. With him, I didn't have to explain that there was something wrong with me. He didn't have to pretend everything was okay. He just knew. I stretched and reluctantly climbed out of bed, following him. It was silent in the kitchen, the slight aroma of coffee still lingering in the air from my husband's morning chores. Roy sat down at my feet, studying me intently, like he was waiting for me to say something. "What do you suggest, smartass?" I rubbed his ear, and he nuzzled into my hand. I knew I should just take the leash now, put on my sneakers, and go for a walk with him. The fresh air, the quiet of the park, the slow run, the sound of his paws on the ground, it always saved me. But today was something else. Today felt like something was about to happen. Roy, as if sensing my hesitation, suddenly jumped up and headed for the door. He turned around impatiently and yapped softly, as if calling to me. I smiled. All right, you got it." I took his leash, but lingered for a second before opening the door. A strange excitement spilled into my chest. As if today would change anything more than just the usual walk. I wasn't expecting anything special. Just a morning, just a park, just a familiar route I'd taken hundreds of times before. Roy ran ahead, enjoying the freedom, wagging his tail and occasionally looking back at me, as if checking, "Are you following me? Are you here?" I smiled. His joy was always contagious. The sun was breaking through the treetops, and the morning was still cool, but the air smelled like spring. I inhaled deeply, savoring the moment when Roy suddenly pulled out of his seat and sprinted forward. "Roy!" I shouted, but it was too late. There was a man's cry, then the sound of footsteps on the gravel. I turned around just in time to see Roy playfully almost knocking the man over. I froze, ready to rush in with an apology, but instead of the expected irritation, the stranger laughed. "That's a lot of pressure." He smoothed his jacket, shaking it off, but he wasn't angry. Roy immediately took on a guilty look and stepped closer, tilting his head slightly. "Well, hello, attacker," the man grinned, holding out his hand to Roy. He sniffed it tentatively, then allowed himself to be stroked. I felt a slight embarrassment. "Sorry, he's just too much of a gambler. Sometimes he forgets that his weight doesn't equal a fluffy lump." "Gorgeous dog," the man said as he continued to pet Roy. "Do you always have that look in your eyes?" I blinked. "Which one?" "It's like you're not here." I froze. His voice was light, not mocking, but there was a note of something in it that hit me deeper than I'd expected. I looked at him closely for the first time. Tall, blonde, with warm brown eyes. The corners of his lips lifted in a half-smile. He seemed relaxed, but there was something alive and real in his gaze. "I'm sorry," I grinned, as if to shake off the sudden tension. I didn't realize I had something written all over me. "Sometimes you don't need to read," he shrugged. "Just seeing is enough." There was silence between us for a second. Roy sat down between us, watching with a satisfied look. He seemed to understand something. "Alexei," the man introduced himself, extending his hand to me. "Anna." I took his palm, and at that moment a strange electric shock ran across my skin. Not the kind that's scary. The one that makes your heart beat a little faster. We started talking. About the dog, about the weather, about how rare it is to meet people who are just there, without masks, without the obligatory formal "what's up?" I laughed. I really laughed. No effort, no contrived politeness. "Can I steal 10 minutes of your time?" he suddenly asked. "For what purpose?" I squinted. "Let's have some coffee. Your dog will approve." I looked at Roy. He stood beside me, his tail wagging quietly, as if in agreement. And without knowing why, I said, "All right." Chuckles. My voice was calm. But something inside me was already trembling. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing this story from, if you've had something similar in your life, and what thoughts you have as the story unfolds. Subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now, here we go. I wasn't looking for that. Seriously. I wasn't looking or waiting. But now, when I woke up in the morning, I found myself reaching for the phone first thing in the morning. Not to check the news or the weather forecast. To see a new message from Alexei. "Good morning. It seems like the perfect day for a walk. What do you think?" Simple words. Ordinary. But they made my heart pound. I wrote that I had things to do. That I wasn't sure. That I would see what the circumstances were. And then I'd go out to the park with Roy anyway. One day I wondered, when did it start? First coffee? First walk? First laugh at something only we understood? Or that moment when he first looked at me differently? It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A spark in the air. A look that lingered a little longer than allowed. A pause in the conversation, filled with something more than words. I couldn't tell you exactly when things changed. But I knew one thing, there was no turning back. Roy knew. He felt. I could see it in his eyes when we'd come home, and he'd cast anxious glances at me. Sometimes he'd just lie down at my feet and whimper softly, like he was trying to warn me. "What do you know, Roy?" I thought. But he just looked at me, devotedly, forgivingly, like he was waiting for me to understand on my own. One day, things went too far. We walked through the city. It was a warm evening, the cool wind playing in my hair, and I felt alive. "You're smiling," Alexei remarked. "Yeah?" I bowed my head a little. "You're like that when you laugh." "Real." I remained silent. Suddenly his hand touched mine. It was an innocent movement. Accidental, I guess. But I didn't take my hand away. And I couldn't pretend I didn't feel everything turning over inside. Somewhere far inside, a thought flashed, "Stop. Now." But I didn't listen to her. Roy pulled the leash tighter, turning sharply toward me, his gaze anxious. He whimpered, as if he sensed I was standing on the edge of something from which there would be no turning back. But I took a step forward. I never thought I'd be in this position. That I would live torn between two worlds, between two men. One was my husband, the man who had always been there for me, who had built this house with me, who knew how I liked coffee in the morning and that I needed 10 minutes of complete silence before going to bed. The other was Alexei, the one who made me laugh for no reason, who looked at me as if he saw not just a woman but a mystery I wanted to solve. I tried to act like my old self. I cooked dinner, met my husband at work, watched movies with him. But inside me was something foreign, new, uncontrollable. Alexei didn't push, didn't demand. He was just being. There were no questions in his voice, but there was expectation in his gaze. And that expectation pulsed inside me, making me wonder, what if? Roy felt. I don't know how, but he sensed everything. When I came back from my meetings with Alexei, he wasn't cheering, not wagging his tail like he usually did. He just looked at me. Not judgmental, but in a way that made it hard for me to breathe. He lay down next to me, as if he knew I was sick, but he didn't ask me anything. Once, when everything inside me was boiling, I closed the door, sank to the floor beside him and buried my face in his fur. "I don't know what to do, Roy." He didn't move, just took a deep breath, as if he understood, and licked my palm. I clenched my fingers into a fist. This world I had lived in before seemed like a cage to me now. But the other world, full of passion, was shaky, unpredictable. I didn't know which one I was, the real me. I stood at the window, watching the raindrops drip down the glass. The room was quiet, except that Roy was curled up in a corner, sniffling softly. His fur twitched a little, as if he were running after something important in his sleep. Maybe something that eluded me, too. My mind was all mixed up. 2 lives, 2 paths, 2 realities in which I existed simultaneously. My husband, Alexei, the house, the parks, the warm evenings at dinner, the stolen meetings, the calls I was afraid to take in front of my husband. Roy's gaze, full of silent understanding. My husband came up behind me and put his arm around my shoulders. I froze. "You haven't been yourself lately." His voice was warm, calm. He didn't suspect anything. Or he did, but he didn't want to know the truth. "Why don't we go somewhere? Together. Just us." I inhaled slowly. "Good idea." But it sounded muffled, as if it wasn't me speaking, but someone else. The phone in my pocket vibrated. I knew who it was. Alexei didn't rush me, but his anticipation hung in the air like a thunderstorm. "You can't stand on the edge forever," he told me recently. But I wasn't standing. I fell a long time ago. I just haven't decided which way I'm going to land yet. Roy opened his eyes and lifted his head. His gaze found me again. I sank down beside him, running my fingers through his warm fur. "You've got it all figured out, Roy." He didn't answer. He just put his big paw over my hand, as if to say, "I'm here. Whatever you choose, I'm staying." Suddenly, a realization hit me. I couldn't imagine my life without him. Without Roy. He was the link between my worlds. The only being I felt truly myself around. But if I choose one of these worlds, won't I lose it? I closed my eyes. And never made a move. What do you think about this story? Have you had similar situations in your life? Your comments are very important. I read every one of them and sincerely appreciate each of you. Subscribe and give me a like so that you don't miss new exciting stories. Write the phrase, "I'm standing on the edge," in the comments if you've listened to the end. Have a good day and see you soon.